Okay, so who read Lamentations this week?
I read through it once, like I didn't take the notes, but
Let's do it 3 times.
Yeah, are you taking notes? Oh, could you? That is brutally bright. Okay. So let's go back to the beginning of this and ask ourselves what is the purpose of Lamentations? What's your reaction whenever you read Lamentations?
Kind of like, whoa, that kind of just happened.
Yeah, it doesn't make you click your heels and feel all like you watch Mary Poppins. You guys even know Mary Poppins?
yeah.
After you watch Mary Poppins, you're like, oh, the world's light and fluffy, and I feel like I could go walking on clouds right now. Whenever you read Lamentations, it sobers you up. It kind of drags you down in a way, but in a good way, because it makes you think and consider about serious things. Why did these things happen? We talked about this a little bit last week, but why did these things happen?
Because people kept not following God's
Okay, for how long?
a long time.
Generations, right? Generation after generation had abandoned God and completely disregarded what he said to do. Now there is a lesson in there for us. Where did that start? Like, do you think they woke up one day and said, I think we should worship Baal today?
No.
No, you don't think they woke up one day and said, you know what? We should go put idols in the temple.
No.
Then how did that happen? How did they get to the point where they were worshiping idols along with God, and in doing so, completely failing to worship God appropriately?
I think that at some point somehow they got the idea in their head that that was the right thing to do.
Okay. Can't really argue against that. I'm sure that at some point somebody didn't go, this is the worst thing we could do, let's do it anyway. I'm sure they thought that it was a good idea. But what caused them to get to the point where they thought that that was okay?
They kept sinning and not asking.
Okay, sin is more of a symptom. Sin is more of a symptom. What was the cause of their sin? What was the cause of their deciding idolatry was a good option to follow? Go back to the root of the problem. What was motivating them to do this?
Maybe like other nations around them.
Okay? That is a very good possibility. Whenever you go back to the beginning of the United Kingdom after the judges, who was the last judge? Anybody remember who the last judge is? Samuel, very good. I was waiting for you to get there. Samuel was the last judge. And the people were unhappy with Samuel's son, judges underneath him, but they don't make it into the song, do they? Eli's sons don't make it into the song either, even though they're judges. But they were unhappy with Samuel's sons as judges. So what they did is they looked around them at all the other nations and they said, give us a king. Give us a king. But who was king during the reign of the judges? God. Some people don't understand that. God was actually king over Israel during that time. God is the one that set the judges in place and used the judges to guide them through their cycle of rejection and then coming back to Him. The judges were the ones that delivered them during those times. And whenever the people said, "We want a king, give us a king," God told Samuel, "They haven't rejected you, they have rejected me." And that's how sin starts in our lives. Whenever we reject God and we do something else. Whenever we say, "Your way isn't good enough, we want to do it a different way. We want to do it our way." Then you get into a lot of trouble. And that's what the people had done leading up to Lamentations. At some point, they had, "Your way isn't good enough, we want to worship Baal as well. Your way isn't good enough, we're going to do what we want to do. Your way isn't good enough, we're going to sin in our lives anyway." And it had just snowballed throughout generations to the point where they were a wicked, horrible people, just like the people around them. We can do that in our lives as well if we're not careful with sin. If we get to a point where without even knowing it, we say, "You know what, God, your way isn't good enough, we're going to do what we want," then you can get to the point in your life where sin will impact it in a terribly negative way, where someone else can look at your life and say, "Wow, that just happened." Right? Wow, look at what havoc that this sin has wreaked on this person's life. And that is ultimately what will happen. And even if people don't see that in this lifetime, you will certainly see it in the next. So whenever we're looking at Lamentations, it's going to hopefully sober our thoughts, help us to think seriously about our lives, about the impact sin has on our life and other people's lives, and to take it seriously and to get rid of anything we have in our lives, to make God a priority and get rid of all the worldly distractions that drag us away from God, right? Because at your age, there's a lot of distractions, right? There's a bunch when you're my age too, but at your age especially going to public school like you guys all do, there's a lot of stuff to drag you away from God being a priority in your life. And if you let that happen, you are that much closer to sin having a horrible impact on your life. That completely. So let's start in verse 7. We are in chapter 2. Yes. "The Lord has scorned his altar and disowned his sanctuary. He has delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. They raised a clamor in the house of the Lord as on the day of festival." Whenever it says that the Lord has scorned his altar and disowned his sanctuary, he's talking about he allowed, like we were talking about last week, he allowed the Babylonians to come into the temple where they weren't even allowed to come and destroy the temple, destroy the altar, carry off all the good stuff, and they just tore it completely down. Solomon had the best stones put in place, the best timber put up, gold coated everything essentially. They stripped the gold off the walls, burned the best wood in the world, and broke in pieces the stones that were the best stones money could buy and threw them away from there. Just completely tore it down. He delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces. The walls were the defense point that made or broke a city. And he allowed Jerusalem's walls to be penetrated. They were the crowning jewel of Jerusalem's defenses, and he gave those over. They raised a clamor in the house of the Lord as on the day of festival. Have you ever been somewhere where there's a big crowd of people and they're excited and they're loud? Like think about like at a ball game whenever something exciting happens right at the buzzer, somebody makes a buzzer beater. It is like a rocket ship is going on so loud in there because everybody's going, ah, I don't know if that's what you guys do nowadays. That's what we did when I was kids. Ah. But imagine how noisy it was when you had 100,000 people or 10,000 people at the temple during a festival, whenever they were celebrating God. Imagine how loud the singing is whenever you have thousands of people singing together. Only this was the Babylonian army making all this noise. The Babylonian army was the ones making a loud noise in the temple when it should have been the children of God. Going into verse 8, the Lord determined to lay in ruins the wall of the daughter of Zion. He stretched out the measuring line. He did not restrain his hand from destroying. He caused a rampart and wall to lament. They languished together. Again, who laid the city in ruins? God did. Who physically did it? The Babylonians, but only because God allowed it. Again, he's not giving the idea that the Babylonians are more powerful than he is. He is taking ownership of the destruction that happened. He stretched out the measuring line. That's an interesting way of describing God taking measure of something. If you have a stick or a board and you're trying to build something and you measure it out and that board doesn't meet the length that you need it to, what do you do with that board?
You don't use it.
You pitch it, right? You throw it to the side. It's useless to me. I can't use this. Whenever God stretched out the measuring line, Jerusalem came up short. Right? They weren't if you stretch out a measuring tape on a fish, if it's not a keeper, you get rid of it, right? That's essentially what happened. He stretched out a measuring line, and Jerusalem fell far short of his standard. Far short. And so because of that, he did not restrain his hand from destroying. He didn't hold back at all. Whenever it talks about God pouring out his wrath later in Lamentations, he didn't just pour out a little bit and then pull it back. He dumped an entire pot of boiling hot anger and allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed because of it. He caused rampart and wall to lament. They languished together. That was part of their defense system. And he was talking about them lamenting. The walls were completely torn down by the time the Babylonians were done to prove a point. Stood that way for decades and decades and decades. No one rebuilt the walls until the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Those walls served as a memory of the sadness that had come on Jerusalem. Her gates have sunk into the ground. He has ruined and broken her bars. They took these huge gates and burned the wood off of them, bent the metal bars that reinforced them, and then left them there. And whenever people lived in the city of Jerusalem after they left, whenever the Jews came back, they had passed through those gates so many times that it almost became something that was just something you see in passing. If the intersection out here gets trashed at 160 and double E, and you go through it every single day, eventually you get used to it being trashed. These were main highways, main entrances to the city, and people just got used to them being trashed by the Babylonians, and it just became something that they were accustomed to. Her king and princes are among the nations. The law is no more. If you go back and you read First and Second Kings and First and Second Chronicles, when you get to Zedekiah gets to the point where he runs away across the plains, right, whenever Babylon enters the city. He gets almost to Jericho, and they capture him, and then they bring him back. Does anybody know what happens to King Zedekiah? All right. They leave him as he is, just long enough to murder his kids in front of him, and then they burn his eyes out so he's blinded. That was something they would do with prominent prisoners of war during that time. If you get blinded, you are essentially impotent from that point on as far as a warrior and a leader. There's no chance of you leading a rebellion if you can't even see your own hands to pick up a sword. So that is what they did to Zedekiah, and then he lived there kind of as a living trophy for Nebuchadnezzar until he died. Her king and her princes are among the nations. The law is no more. You can't follow the law of Moses to the fullest extent that you should if there's no temple. If there's no temple, there's no priesthood working in the temple, there's no altar to sacrifice on, you cannot do what the law of Moses says to do. And here's where you get a big departure from what the Old Testament actually says and modern Judaism. There is no hope of the temple being rebuilt. They have no hope of the priesthood being put back in place the way that it should through Levitical lineage. And there's no hope of them being able to sacrifice the way that they should. So they have this twisted system of worship that is not at all what God put in place for the Jews. So modern Jews have no hope of being followers of the instructions of God that they believe are still in effect because the temple can never be rebuilt. They have the same problem here. The temple's gone. You can't go to the priest if you have leprosy and show it to him the way that you were supposed to if you caught leprosy. You can't go to the temple and offer a sacrifice the way you're supposed to if you have sin in your life. If you have some uncleanness, you have no ability to go offer the offering that was supposed to cleanse you from that. So the law is no more. And then, to continue in verse 9, and her prophets find no vision from the Lord. God has cut them off, essentially. Now, not completely, because Jeremiah still confers with the Lord, but there's a period after Jeremiah to the end of Daniel where there's nothing really that happens. Like Daniel has some ability to interpret dreams from God in Babylon, but other than that, there are no prophets running around. There are no prophets saying this is what God says to do. He made them wait until the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then the prophecy Jeremiah gave about 70 years comes true, and they go back to Jerusalem. But imagine having this communication with God and that being severed. And imagine what it would be like in your life if something horrible and gut-wrenching happened. If your family is killed and you're taken to Mexico as a slave to work in a labor camp, and you have no Bible. You have no way to know what God wants you to do. There's that. That would be even more gut-wrenching. It would make that situation that much worse. Verse 10, the elders of the daughter of Zion sit on the ground in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young women of Jerusalem have bowed their head to the ground. So the elders were the leaders of the community. They sit on the ground in silence. Now, elders typically would sit at a gate and confer with one another, talk with one another, and then whenever someone needed help, they would offer assistance, judgment, they would settle disputes, stuff like that. They're just sitting on the ground in silence. There's nothing to say. There's no point in speaking. There's nothing to talk about. Hey, how's your crops coming? How's the family doing? Well, my family's dead and the Babylonians ate my crops. They have nothing to converse about. They're just sitting there in silence. And I don't know if you've ever had something traumatic happen in your life. Someone dies or something horrible happens. You just don't want to talk. You just want to sit there quietly and either have a blank slate in your mind or just think about what's happening and try to process it slowly. You just don't want to talk about it necessarily. And if something happens where someone wants to talk to you about something, a lot of times they have to drag it out of you. You just don't want to talk. And that's what's happened to the elders here that are left. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. That's a sign of repentance and mourning, one of the signs. Sackcloth was like this burlappy stuff that was really rough. What it would do is it would chafe your skin. It would rub and make you uncomfortable, and that would put you in a place of discomfort where you were aware of that discomfort. We see that happen several times through the Old Testament, where someone is repenting, or they are mourning, and they'll put that on, and it essentially makes you miserable. But it was a way for them to process and mourn as well as repent. The young women of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. You do this whenever you are being humbled and you're powerless, essentially. A king doesn't walk up to a commoner and bow down and put his head on the ground in front of that person. You never ever see that happen. What you will do is see someone that is humble and powerless put their head on the ground and as a sign of their humility. So the young women have been humbled. My eyes are spent with weeping, and my stomach churns. The impact of this happening had moved this man, who I think is Jeremiah, to cry himself empty. Essentially, it had moved him to tears. I don't know if you guys have ever had something horrible happen and you cry yourself out. You just cry until you can't cry anymore, and that is whenever you finally stop. Whenever it says, my eyes are spent with weeping, he literally can't cry anymore. Something horrible happens in your life, it will tie your stomach up in knots. And that's what has happened here. My stomach churns. It's upset him severely. My bile is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of the daughter of my people. Sometimes in movies or shows, a person that's never seen a dead body before, whenever they see a dead body, they like stagger around, they stumble over somewhere off camera, and they throw up. Well, that's what had happened here. Because of the horrible things that happened, it had moved him to throw up because he was so sick at what had happened. Because infants and babies faint in the streets of the city. As bad as it was during the siege, imagine the orphans left behind after their families had been killed. If a soldier had mercy and did not kill a tiny infant but killed the rest of the family, imagine how horrible it would be to be in a city of corpses, a destroyed city full of corpses of your people, listening to babies scream their heads off because they had no one to take care of them. And how much more that would pile on to your plate emotionally. This man has endured something that none of us likely ever will, but we can identify with what he's feeling whenever we have something bad happen in our life. We can look back and say, I remember that feeling. I remember that feeling and how terrible it was. And we need to remember the reason he was feeling this feeling was because of sin. And if we want to avoid having more of those types of feelings in our lives, it will be helpful to not have sin in our lives. They cry to their mothers, talking about the babies, where is bread and wine, as they faint like a wounded man in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. I think this is a throwback to whenever the siege was still happening. It would be terrible to have a child that you cannot feed. Whenever you have a little baby, you can't just feed them whatever you come up with. You can't just be like, oh, I got pizza today. Here's some pizza, little 6-month-old. It'll tear them up. They can't process it. They're designed for milk. Well, whenever a woman does not have enough food, her milk supply dries up and she can't feed her child. So imagine being the mother that can't feed her child and is watching her child starve to death as her baby screams on her chest. Imagine how horrible that would be. What can I say for you? To what compare you, O daughter of Jerusalem? What can I liken you to that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter of Zion? And essentially he's saying, you are beyond comparison. There is nothing to compare you to. Other cities through history were destroyed. Other other nations had another a foreign nation come in, destroy their capital, and kill a bunch of their people. That's not anything necessarily new. But to have it happen to God's people, to the people that were supposed to be the chosen people of God, that had never happened this way. Not to this degree. There was no comparison. For your ruin is as vast as the sea. Who can heal you? The sea, they didn't have a globe at the time. They couldn't be like, oh, there's 4,000 miles between Georgia and London. You know, they couldn't look at a globe and be like, the sea is huge. The sea was something that was almost never ending to them. It was something that you could not see the end of. Whenever you stand at a beach and look off in the horizon at the ocean, it just seems to go on forever. He's saying your ruin, it seems to go on forever. It's never ending. It's beyond measure. The sea is something that they couldn't measure. It's beyond measure. Who can heal you? And I want us to stop and answer that question. If we ever find ourselves in a point in our lives where we are sitting there going, my life is in shambles, or something, a part of my life even is in shambles, I have sin in my life, it's thrown a kink in my entire life, something has happened, who can heal my life? Well, the answer has always been God. God was the one that cared for the people that were committed to him in Babylon. If you think just a short time after Lamentations is written, a very short time, 3 men were thrown into a fiery furnace as punishment by the same king that destroyed Jerusalem. And what happened to them? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah would not bow their knee before this huge golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar had built. They refused to worship the idol that he had made. Nebuchadnezzar threw them into a burning pit that killed his Navy SEAL equivalents. The best soldiers in his army were killed from the heat from the furnace. What happened to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as he called them?
They were fine.
They were fine. Right? Whenever they came out, they didn't even smell like smoke. They were delivered through a miracle by God. The same God that allowed Jerusalem to be destroyed delivered these godly men whenever they needed it. And if you remember what they said, it is so important. He said, or they said, our God can deliver us. But even if he doesn't, we will not bow. We will not kneel before this idol. They knew that God might not deliver them, but that he would deliver them eternally, and that he was worth serving. So whenever we ask ourselves, who can heal us? Who can heal our broken lives? Who can heal our life, or the part of our life that is in shambles? If we will be committed to God, God is capable of healing our life. He might not bring back dead loved ones. He might not fix the problems in our past. He might not even take away the consequences that we have to face in the future from what we've done in the past. But he can heal us on a spiritual level, and that is the most important level. Your prophets have seen for you false and deceptive visions. Oh man, if you read Jeremiah and study Jeremiah, they had so many false prophets. So many false prophets. And that is one of the reasons they would not listen to Jeremiah. The false prophets told them what they wanted to hear. They have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, but have seen for you oracles that are false and misleading. If the false prophets would have told the truth about the iniquity and the sin in their lives, iniquity is a strong word. It's different from sin, just a little bit. Iniquity is doing something wrong on purpose. It's not doing your best and accidentally messing up. It is like shaking your fist at God and saying, I'll do it my way. I don't care what you say, I'm going to do it my way. So whenever it says they have not exposed your iniquity to restore your fortunes, if they would have realized they were wrong and repented of it, they would have been living high on the hog, the same way that God promised all the way back in Deuteronomy 28. All the way back whenever he said, I'm going to give you this land. If you follow me, you will live in abundance. And that's a paraphrase. But I've seen few oracles that are false and misleading. And one of the last messages that the false prophets gave them was that they would be delivered from Babylon, that they would not be destroyed. And now look at them. They have to know that their false prophets were false. There was no way of denying it. All who pass along the way clap their hands at you. They hiss and wag their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of all of the earth? Do you guys remember the Joplin tornado from several years back? All right. What happened whenever the Joplin tornado wiped out a huge chunk of Joplin was, after a little while, it became a sightseeing venture. Right? People would drive all the way down to Joplin just to look at the destruction that happened in Joplin, to take pictures and be like, wow, this was really terrible. Jerusalem became a sightseeing detour to a lot of people. We heard Jerusalem got trashed. Well, we're going, kind of that way. Let's swing over and see it. Everyone who came along is clapping, going, happy to see it happen. We hated those Israelites. We hated those Jews. And so they hiss and wag their heads. And they're just, you ever shake your head at something? Whenever you see something happen to somebody, when you hear of something happening to somebody you warn them about, you just shake your head at them. I told him it was going to happen. I told him if he didn't straighten up, he was gonna have something horrible happen in his life. They hiss and wag their heads at the daughter of Jerusalem. Is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty, the joy of all the earth? And it was. It was the place where God's temple was at. And God's temple was beautiful. Beautiful. It was a place that was a shining jewel in the crown of the Israelite nation. And they're sitting there going, I can't believe this is the same place. This place looks horrible. All your enemies rail against you. They hiss. They gnash their teeth. They cry, we have swallowed her. Ah, this is the day we longed for. Now we have it. We see it. They're celebrating. They're celebrating. We are so glad they got what we think is coming to them. What we thought they should get, they finally got. So they're celebrating, but I want you guys to understand that their joy is temporary. Their joy is temporary. The same people that are celebrating Jerusalem being trashed all eventually got destroyed. Where's Babylon now? When's the last time you heard of somebody going to Babylon in the Middle East? It's gone, right? Archaeologists go there, but it's gone. Babylon was destroyed, completely wiped off the map. Jerusalem as a city is still around. Babylon's gone. When's the last time you heard of the Philistine nation rising up and becoming a world power? Philistines are gone. The Amorite people are gone. The Perizzites are all gone. A lot of the nations, Egypt might technically be an exception, but a lot of the nations that surrounded Israel are gone. Completely and utterly gone. So they were celebrating what happened, but their celebration was temporary. They got what they had coming because of their sin eventually. The Lord has done as he purposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. If we had a boatload of time, we would go to Deuteronomy 28 and read verses 15 through 68. The first 15 verses in that chapter are God saying, if you do what I say, I will bless you. You will have plenty. You will have a lot of food. you will just have a life of abundance. The next 53 verses are God telling you, this is what will happen if you disobey me. And he gets detailed. And guess what? Lamentations talks about how God kept his word and did everything he said. Now we can parallel that spiritually because God tells us about heaven. God tells us this is what is going to happen if you obey me. This is the great blessing that you will get if you are a child of mine that is faithful. But did you guys ever realize that Jesus talked more about hell than he ever talked about heaven? Jesus brought a message of warning. This is what is going to happen if you don't do what God says to do. If you don't follow what I'm teaching you, this is what's going to happen. And hell is a terrible place. Well, in this case, they had a message of this is what's going to happen and it's going to be terrible. And they did not listen. And God followed through and did what he said he would. And if he did this to them, all the things that we read about, then we can believe that hell is as bad as God says it is. Hell will actually happen. It will actually be a punishment that God follows through on if we don't obey God. So we need to take this, that God has done what he purposed. He carried out his word that he commanded long ago. The same God gave a similar command to us long ago. Back whenever Christ was here and the New Testament was being written, whenever the apostles and Christ and the other New Testament writers said, hell is real and it's a horrible place, but you're going to go there if you don't obey God. That was said a long time ago, but the same God that fulfilled what he said a long time ago then, when we're reading Lamentations, will do the exact same thing in our lives and whenever Christ comes back. He'll do what he says. He will follow through on what he said long ago. Now listen to this. He has thrown down without pity. Why did God close the door on the ark? Whenever the flood happened, it says that God shut the door. Why do you think that God shut the door instead of telling Noah to do it?
Because Noah wouldn't have done it.
I don't know that he wouldn't have. We can't say that for sure. But we can say that it would have been a horrible temptation to him, for sure. Whenever people realized what was happening, then, oh man, I would have a hard time not taking pity on the people with kids outside, the women and the children, and let that door down. Come on in before the waters get to us. Come on in. But God shut the door, and he had no pity on the people outside. They had already sealed their fate with the sinful lives that they had lived. The people here had sealed their fates with the sinful lives that they had lived, and God had no pity. And whenever the day of judgment comes, where you and I would probably crumble and break down and say, tell you what, okay, I know you didn't do everything you were supposed to, but okay, let's go ahead and take you to heaven. You know, you had a hard life, hard circumstances. There were stuff that I didn't have to deal with. So I tell you what, you come on in. But God has no pity for the people that do not obey him. He says he's going to do something. If you do this, then I will do this. If you don't do this, if you're wicked instead, then this is what's going to happen. And he doesn't make exceptions to cross that line. He doesn't go, well, tell you what, I'll make an exception for you this one time. It says that he has thrown down without pity. And that is something that, again, should sober us, should make us desire to follow him and to know that whenever he says he's going to do something, we can have faith in that, either for good or for bad. But God does not say something and then change his mind. He's always the same. All right, we should end there. All right. Thanks, guys.